No one really knows what Dark Souls is about. Sure, there have been many valiant attempts by members of its community to piece together its lore, and yes, there's a reasonable consensus about the general overarching plot. But why do we continue to find it endlessly fascinating? Is it the challenge, ambiguity, atmosphere, themes, immersiveness, or complexity? Perhaps it's all these things. I don't think it's a coincidence that one of the single most unforgiving games in recent history, dripping in dread, despair, and dilapidated decor, happens to be one of the most talked about games in our medium, has inspired a quasi-genre of its own, and serves as a gatekeeper into the hallowed halls of gaming elitism. What does it say about us that we revel in the punishment and madness it inflicts upon us? Life is about death and madness, goes the saying, and maybe that describes why we fetishize this masochistic piece of media. The paradox can only be confronted if we recognize that there is genuine pleasure in hardship, palpable purpose in punishment, and ultimately, fun to be had through failure. Dark Souls is a distillation of what it means to be human. Its brilliance, however, is that it systemizes the human tragedy in a way that makes us just love it.
Yes, indeed. The dark sign brands the undead. And in this land, the undead are corralled and led to the north. Where they are locked away to await the end of the world.
Dark Souls is a 3D action RPG developed by an Eastern developer, but infused with Western sensibilities. Immediately we see the duality the game embodies. Western RPGs like Fallout and Mass Effect tend to be about letting us create our own characters and living out a fantasy. Japanese RPGs like Final Fantasy and Kingdom Hearts tend to have a suite of well-defined characters with their own motivations that we get invested in. The line between these two is not impermeable, but I'm speaking in generalities. Dark Souls is a Western RPG developed by a Japanese company, featuring architecture from Europe, but confronting themes of cycles and reincarnation from the East, and futility and nihilism inherited from the West. It's everything all at once, yet at the same time, impenetrable, elusive, and mysterious. The game occupies the space between things in all its dimensions. It's Eastern and Western, high fantasy and demonic, about death and life, futility and triumph, light and darkness. It has vague themes and narrative structure, but the rules governing it are precise and exacting. We live in the space between things as an undead being, neither living nor dead. And this ambiguous purgatory is exactly what the director, Hidetaka Miyazaki, was aiming for. Miyazaki was inspired by the English RPGs of his youth that he could not understand for himself. In order to get the most out of his experiences, he conjured up stories of his own to fill in the ambiguity. Does this sound familiar? This need is not exclusive to obscure Japanese game developers. It is intrinsic to us as a species. Without closure or explanations, we are facing a vast, meaningless cosmos with us as its sole witnesses. Instead, we read stories into things, placating our angst about our isolation. What do you see here? Do you see a bunch of shapes moving about, or a narrative about danger, predation, escape, and triumph? The researchers Hyder and Simmel found out that most people infuse the scene with narrative energy, despite being about a bunch of shapes. The game Thomas Was Alone took this to heart, using different shapes to represent different characteristics. Psychologists and anthropologists argue we have what they hail a hyper-agency detection module, an instinct to see purpose and design where it might not be. The reason for this is deeply evolutionary, as assuming the rustling of leaves is a tiger as opposed to the wind could be a truly adaptive precaution. Needless to say, we have been conjuring up myths, gods, and legends our entire existence for these exact reasons, driven by a need to explain the seemingly arbitrary pattern surrounding us. Having some explanation is better than having no explanation, and ergo, the voracious lore community of Dark Souls. The rabbit hole one can go down with the collective storytelling chops on display is nothing short of astonishing. People scrounge from obtuse lines of dialogue, item descriptions, the world itself, and the context of certain events. I have no doubt that many of the Dark Souls community could put archaeologists to shame. They employ a whole host of storytelling styles, like modern-day bards revealing wisdom to us ignorant masses. This obsessive forensic analysis is more strange as the overarching plot of the game is fairly straightforward. Much like many a mythology, in the beginning, the world was shrouded in fog. Suddenly, fire entered the world and there was disparity, creating form out of chaos. Much like the war between the Titans and the gods in Greek mythology, there is a war between the dragons and the gods in Dark Souls, which ends in the king of the gods, Gwyn, think of him like Zeus, ushering in an age of fire. However, this age needs constant renewal, and the inevitable death of the world lingers over all its inhabitants. This theme is common globally, where a once pristine state of nature is violated by the corruptibility of man, whether Eden, Arcadia, or the golden ages of old. Gwyn realizes the age of the gods is dwindling and sacrifices himself to allow his age of fire to persist. But this act casts a curse upon all humans, searing them with a dark sign that renders us all undead. We are cursed with perpetual death, with every cycle hallowing out our souls until we are driven to meandering husks. Enter the protagonist of this game, you presumably, prophesized as being the chosen undead, who is to inherit the mantle from Gwyn to link the flame once more and reignite the Age of Fire. Thus far, this sounds much like the well-popularized hero's journey of Joseph Campbell's fame. For those unfamiliar, Joseph Campbell wrote a book entitled A Hero with a Thousand Faces that argues for something called a monomyth, the idea that all stories ever told and continue to be told adhere to a singular template. Even George Lucas claims to have used this template for his Star Wars saga.
Requires a death and resurrection, and that is the basic motif of the hero journey. Leaving one condition, finding the source of life to bring you forth in a richer or more mature or other condition.
There is an ordinary world, the inside of a cell that sees you rotting till Armageddon, where the chosen undead finds himself imprisoned at the start. A call to adventure happens in the form of these keys that are conveniently dropped down for you. An inciting event leads to a crossing of a threshold after you defeat a threshold guardian. You are then whisked away to another realm where there is no return.
Day an undead shall be chosen.
You then embark on a road of trials in the form of an inordinate number of bosses. You reunite with the mother, reconcile with the father, receive assistance from some friends and serpentine miscreants, or on your way to journey's end you overcome your own death many a time, and this endlessly recurring apotheosis allows you to defeat the tyrannical king of old to usher in a new age of peace, prosperity, and light. It's fitting that Campbell's monomyth is meant to apply to all mythologies across the world, allowing for the game to accommodate its global set of themes. But is this what Dark Souls is really about? A heroic individual who reinvigorates society from within? If this is the case, in this sense, the difficulty of the game is a very potent metaphor for the tribulations surrounding heroism and transformation. It quite literally puts you in the ordeal a hero might have to go to rescue civilization. However, Dark Souls elegantly subverts this traditional heroic narrative. At the end of the game, it's left unclear whether linking the flame is the right thing to do or not. During your quest, two different serpents implore you to do two different things, one urging you to follow your destiny and the other to let the Age of Fire end. Who should you trust? It's never made explicitly clear, but it's enough to introduce doubt into your mind.
After the advent of fire, the ancient lords found the three souls, but your progenitor found a fourth, unique soul, the Dark Souls. Your ancestor claimed the Dark Souls and waited for fire to subside. And soon the flames did fade, and only dark remained. Thus began the Age of Men, the Age of Dark. However, Lord Gwyn trembled at the dark, clinging to his Age of Fire and in dire fear of humans, and the Dark Lord who would one day be born amongst them. Lord Gwyn resisted the course of nature by sacrificing himself to link the fire and commanding his children to shepherd the humans. Gwyn has blurred your past to prevent the birth of the Dark Lord.
By questioning the legitimacy of renewing civilization, Dark Souls critiques the very idea of renewal and persistence. Why should we persist? Are we deserving of it? What are the consequences? Why do we blindly abide by the dogmas of the past? What is the point of these endless cycles of light and darkness, and why are we, as game players, always eager to play the role of sacrificial lamb? There is a meta dimension to this as well, because it's kind of critiquing why we continue to embody the same heroic narrative again and again in all the games we play. This part of Dark Souls' ambiguity is conveyed with exacting precision. Supposedly, Gwyn is keeping alight the Age of Gods, and we, as the Chosen One, are allowing their reign to persist. The other ending sees the player allowing the Age of Light to end, with a new Dark Age being ushered in under the protagonist. Is this a new age of man? Is it evil or is it good? Our traditional symbolism associates lightness with goodness and darkness with sin, but perhaps Dark Souls is subverting the trope.
My Lord, bless thy safe return. Let Carth and Frank serve your Highness. We are here to serve your Highness. True dark be cast upon the world. Our Lord hath returned.
It is in fact humanity who possesses fragments of the titular Dark Souls. So does that make us born in original sin or imbued with universal goodness? Is man, as Jean-Jacques Rousseau said, born free and then lives everywhere in chains? Or is the state of nature nasty, brutish, and short? By reveling in its ambiguity, Dark Souls highlights the intractable duality of these questions. It clarifies ambiguity, if that's clear. Death is inevitable. If Ernst Becker is to be believed, this guiding fear apparently governs our every move, forcing us to try and stave it away, prolong our life, deny immortality, or just accept it. It's a particular predicament for a self-aware species as it allows us to picture our own annihilation. The most upsetting thing in the world might just be that the world goes on without us, but maybe that's comforting. Becker thinks depression comes from failing in our immortality project. Schizophrenia and madness arise from denying reality, and creativity is driven by trying to overcome it. Perhaps death intensifies meaning, which is the central paradox to be solved in our infatuation with Dark Souls. All the characters in the game start off cogent, lucid, and sometimes just plain friendly, but by the game's end they have all descended into madness. They are all on their own quests of righteousness, wisdom, and beauty, but they all fall one way or the other. Failing in trying to creatively overcome the inevitable death of their universe, perhaps all these characters have no option but to wither away. This might seem abject and dreary, but really, it's a reminder for us to all dare not go hollow.
Goodbye then. Be safe, friend. Don't you dare go hollow.
In Dark Souls, death is not like other games. There is genuine loss to it, both for the character as well as us, the player. Our avatar loses a bit of his humanity every time he dies, and we lose all the souls, progress, and perhaps some of our will. It's a beautiful metaphor in some sense, finding a way to represent mechanically the loss of these digitized husks to us, the player. Recall that in the universe of Dark Souls, every time you die, you just lose a bit of yourself. Why try if every loss puts you back? Well, that's because not everything is lost. We still preserve our skills, our acumen, and our knowledge of what transpired. Death is not a chance for meaning, but also learning. Dark Souls highlights how purpose should always come from within, by elucidating how it is you that has to improve to overcome. Miyazaki never intended for his games to be hard. He was trying to create a certain atmosphere, and he found that death through difficulty was the best way to tell it. Hardship sharpens us. Anyone who is trained to play a Souls game knows never to just leap into a new area, is always observant, constantly vigilant, deliberate in combat, and hyper-attentive to enemy patterns and moves. For the duration they inhabit the world of Lordran, they feel truly alive. The difficulty is never unfair though, with some glaring exemptions, and is governed by a very precise set of systems and rules that can be uncovered over time. Because the game is not overly forthcoming about what to do and how to do it, we feel like we have accomplished something ourselves. If games are fundamentally about challenge, tutorials and easy modes might seem self-undermining. In a world of suffocating tutorialization, Dark Souls trusts us to be free. Why does this matter though? I've listened to people who claim Dark Souls helped them with suicidal depression, because although it is soul-crushing, it is a surmountable challenge. Suicidal ideation sets in when you see no way of escaping your current predicament, which some might think characterizes Dark Souls, but that's really not the case here. If you are stuck, you can find a way to level up by doing side tasks, improve your weapons, explore more of the world, or more importantly, you can solicit the aid of others. Yes, in a world of stark and unyielding isolation, the game is brimming with life. The multiplayer works differently here as well. In the story of the game as well as our reality, it takes place in simultaneous and overlapping worlds. You summon people into your world to aid in conquering a troublesome beast, and nothing quite captures the joy of jolly cooperation. Implicitly, Dark Souls is telling us that when you are struggling at your most, when you are lonely and in despair, the best thing you can do is to lean on others for help. There are always people willing to assist, and there are always people going through the same struggles you are. The game leaves these often comical reminders of others' failures in the form of bloodstains, forcing you to bear witness to other people's suffering. This is not arbitrary malice, this is all deliberately designed. To confront hardship voluntarily and with others is one way of overcoming your fears and anxieties, and Dark Souls positively revels in instilling this in us. There's a curious inversion of the Christian religion in Dark Souls. Jesus sacrificed himself to redeem mankind, but Gwyn's sacrifice led to their eternal damnation. In Dark Souls, instead of being redeemed vicariously, you have to be redeemed yourself. The only way you do this is by shouldering the burden of constant and interminable hardship, and pushing back against the curse. By framing the insurmountable as surmountable, by trusting us to overcome it without being patronizing, by subtly guiding us to seek the aid of others, and by showing the liabilities of losing your will in the form of hollowing, Dark Souls makes you the hero whilst also deconstructing it in its own narrative. I said it was ambiguous. As punishment for violating some arbitrary norms, Sisyphus was condemned to roll a boulder up a hill for all eternity. Once he got to the top, the boulder would just roll all the way back down and he'd be forced to start over. The core of the story is the idea of futility and purposelessness, or as Tubi and Nier Automata put it,
We are perpetually trapped in a never-ending spiral of life and death. Is this a curse? Or some kind of punishment? I often think about the God who blessed us with this cryptic puzzle, and wonder if we'll ever have the chance to kill him.
We are not reviving automatons though. We only have one life. For a mortal being, the death in a game is analogous to a failure in the real world, whether personally or professionally. This can be crippling both for our self-esteem as well as our existential plight. Failure and repetition in the real world can lead to depression and madness, but then I can ask why the hell we play games when it seems to center around the things known as fail states and endless cycles of dying. Why do we love failure in games but hate it in the real world? Jasper Jewell calls games the art of failure, suggesting it defines what games are about. Think about how people dismiss walking simulators as not games because they don't have two key ingredients: fail states and challenge. Games like Dear Esther and Gone Home are classified as insufficiently gamey, as they focus exclusively on storytelling. Perhaps we're missing the point though. The art of death and challenge tells its own story. To solve the paradox inherent in Dark Souls, we have to understand why we love failure. We can start with an easier question. Why do we love watching others suffer? Why do we like watching The Walking Dead or Breaking Bad when really as humans we should be wanting to avoid hardship at all costs? Maybe it's a kind of cynical schadenfreude, feeling good about ourselves after seeing others mired in crap. Maybe, as Aristotle thought, tragedies are cathartic, a way for us to get rid of latent emotions that need to be expressed in a way to remind us of what we have. It stands to reason that the benefits of witnessing horror outweighs the cost. In Dark Souls, death has consequences, real consequences. But really, how real are they? You're still sitting in your living room hitting a plastic device, not on a spirit quest to Anor Londo. The trick seems to be that when we subconsciously know we are safe, but consciously feel we are in peril, we have a way of deriving pleasure from the endeavor. Failure in the real world has real consequences, whereas failure in stories and games are ultimately safe. Dark Souls is the ultimate expression of this paradoxical pleasure. We grind, suffer, wander aimlessly in despair, but we know we can switch the console off and come back later. Unlike in schools where a bad grade can ruin your future, games allow you to jump right back in. Failure and suffering are not to be avoided. They are to be confronted and relished, as that's how you triumph. Oh, and how triumphant is that triumph. I don't think anything compares to the sensation of having finally defeated Ornstein and Smo in Anor Londo. I don't know how long it took you to defeat this duo, but it took me more tries than I care to admit. One of these bosses is nimble and precise, the other lumbering and hard-hitting. It seems like there's never an opening to hit one before the other maims you from behind. But you do it. Somehow you do it. Ultimately, we love challenge and hardship when we are safe and we confront it voluntarily, which is ultimately why we love games. If this is why we love games, then Dark Souls is the purest expression of what a game is. The world of Dark Souls feels like a genuine world of its own. It isn't an elaborate stage, set dressing with avatars populating a high fantasy realm, but a self-contained reality of its own. NPCs aren't there to serve you, they have their own agendas. One second they're in Firelink Shrine and the next they're gone, servicing their own ambitions. The world of Dark Souls is not here to ingratiate you. It lives completely indifferent to you. How better to simulate a real world than one that doesn't care about you? The world itself feels organic because its design seems to be one of a coherent place. It's this elaborate, interconnected labyrinth with astonishing verticality as well. You descend to the misleadingly titled depths, only to realize it leads to a bog-infested underground cavern in the form of Blighttown, which then descends into the demon ruins and then Lost Izalith. Because none of the exploration is explicitly prompted, you feel like you are genuinely journeying to the center of the earth, in the vein of the Jules Verne classic. And this sense of adventure is seldom found in games that guide you directly. At times, the ambiguity seems a little too harsh. Like when you first arrive at Firelink Shrine, you are told you have to ring the 2 bells of awakening. And the only piece of advice you are given is one lies above and the other below. That's it. The opening area itself has 3 directions you can go in once you are put to the task, and so you set on your merry way. One direction sees you run into reviving skeletons. Bad idea. The other has you accosted by invulnerable ghosts. Even worse. The third path has perfectly manageable foot soldiers, and so you gleefully press on. Although it is vague and ostensibly directionless, the game implicitly guides you a specific direction by modulating the level of challenge. It just trusts us to be smart enough to realize this. The game has an overarching plot, but much of the narrative beauty comes from the small vignettes of different characters you meet along the way. Most of these tales have a dark twist to them, in keeping with the themes of madness, decay, and futility. There's the fan-favorite Knight Solaire, a conspicuously joyful knight who aids you on your travels, and all he wants is a glimpse of the sun. However, he ends up consumed by it. He's reminiscent of the Greek figure Icarus, who flew too close to the sun and was burnt by it. Eventually, you the player have to put him out of his misery, but this is framed as a tragic and unavoidable mess, not an act of glory and triumph. To see a singular light of joy and vitality being reduced to madness is an absolute gut punch. In fact, it seems tragedy is the default setting of Lordran, a place without hope of any kind. Dostoevsky said that to live without hope is to not live at all, and this is precisely what the game is telling us. As I said before, the heroic arcs of all these characters is subverted in one way or the other, leading to the unholy trinity of depression, madness, and death. Witnessing their downfalls is that act of catharsis Aristotle spoke of, a reminder that we should persist despite other people's failings. Sometimes we directly contribute to the tragic state of affairs. Take the story of Artorius, one of the knights of Gwyn who voyaged to Ulasil to conquer the encroaching abyss that was swallowing everything in its path. Much like the other characters, Artorius succumbs to the demons he was trying to destroy. The chosen undead, through some elaborate series of actions, ends up traveling back in time to quell the scourge that Artorius failed to push back against, but on his way has to kill the corrupted Artorius. Artorius had a wolf, Sif, who accompanied him, and his final act before he was driven to madness was to cast a protection spell so she wasn't consumed by the physical manifestation of the scourge called Manus. You kill Artorius, save Sif from Manus and the rest of the world from the abyss, travel back to the future from whence you came, where you meet Sif once more, now as a fully grown giant wolf. Actually, most players would have killed Sif in the future before returning to the past that birthed her, but I digress. She is tending to the grave of her master, the one you had no choice but to kill to save both her and the world, but this doesn't stop you from locking arms and claws in conflict. She recognizes you, presumably understanding that your hands were tied, but it doesn't matter. Her love for her master and her need to avenge him outweigh these petty considerations. There is no triumph here, only death. The battle has this beautiful haunting music that seems out of place for a triumphant battle, and when you whittle down the wolf's health, she starts to visibly fade and whimper. It's amazing how framing changes everything, and this is masterfully executed. This Shakespearean parable is never told to us explicitly. It exists in the world for us to uncover at our leisure, or our peril. In the arcade era, games were difficult because that fit the economic needs of the time. The way for developers to generate revenue was for them to get the players to pony up additional quarters, and the only way for them to weave this into their games is if they killed you repeatedly. Today, however, with the blossoming home console market, games are shipped with ways to render them accessible to the widest possible market, because that's how you make money in the modern era. Dark Souls doesn't seem to care about trends though. Or does it? Promoting yourself as hard has become its own elaborate marketing ploy, seen in the advertising campaign of the Soulsborne games that say, "Prepare to die." It was a niche that was ripe for the taking, an advantage that has seen the birth of the meme, "The Dark Souls off." What does it mean to say that something is the Dark Souls off? What is this essence of Dark Soulness? Superficially, it's a reference to difficulty, but that is so grotesquely oversimplifying the point so as to border on insulting. In any case, what does Dark Souls represent for the medium? To many, Dark Souls seems like a reactionary movement, the equivalent of white supremacist agitators irked by the changes of the civil rights movement. As games are extending to more people, the thing that people love is being diluted by ever more watered-down experiences. Dark Souls is a violent rejection of the arc of history for the gaming medium, a call to revert back to an age of diabolical difficulty and genuine challenge. In fact, in many ways, the Dark Souls franchise is to the gaming medium what the Chosen Undead is to the world of Lordran. Both are violent refusals of the status quo and preordained truths. You as the Chosen Undead come to confront the ambiguity of the eternal task of linking the flame. Dark Souls as a game mirrors this. It pushes back against the demands of an ever-popularizing medium. So there's this renegade impulse built into the Dark Souls ethos, despite becoming a massive series in itself. Its success has spawned a whole host of copycats, and imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. This has seen an incredible array of Dark Souls pretenders, sometimes dubbed soul-likes, Lords of the Fallen, Neo, The Surge, Salt and Sanctuary, and more are variations on the theme of Dark Souls with their own creative amendments. All these games are actually selling torture and death for a modest fee, and although they don't see the same level of success, they seem to be finding their own niche. Difficulty, deliberate thoughtful action, an oppressive atmosphere, obtuse stories hidden behind items, these seem to be a common theme. What these descriptions miss are the many things I've already outlined. It's the psychology of triumph in the face of hardship. It's the ambiguity of patterns and directed purpose. It's the inversion of myths and overarching trends. It's confronting chaos with the aid of others. It's the catharsis that accompanies bearing witness to suffering and mental decay. It's about feeling alive by confronting death. It's about the pleasure of failure in a safe context, and it's about leveraging all these things to put the player in a particular psychological space. That space is one of reveling in the meaning and inevitability of suffering in life, and that's what truly makes us alive. Games are often lambasted for being overly eager to employ violence as a language, and you can't blame outsiders for coming to this conclusion. It's hard for games to systemize in mechanics the way conflict is represented in other mediums. Paintings can swish color together, books can just write out descriptions, and movies can frame conflicts from conversation to manipulation. The language of games is inherently spatial, which is why we get lots of platformers and shooters. Conflict is represented by attacking things through space or avoiding and navigating around things in space. You might think this is limiting, but most of our communication is conveyed through body language. The real problem stems from trying to justify the violence and mayhem in games in the narrative. Analysts have a pretentious word for this. It's called ludonarrative dissonance. Nathan Drake is a plucky, adventurous globetrotter who happens to murder thousands. Why? All for the sake of treasure. But treasure is what we all seek in games, whether an arbitrary goal, a princess in the case of Mario, or an achievement. These are all extrinsic goals in some sense. An intrinsic goal would have us strive to achieve it for its own sake. Dark Souls has such a goal. It's about putting up or shutting up, improving or retrieving, or in the vulgar ways of the internet, getting good. Dark Souls suffers from none of this dissonance though. The world is malicious and out to get you. It exists regardless of whether you intervene or not. Conflict and violence are the only plausible language of survival and triumph, making your actions feel in perfect accord with the themes at play. The combat here is deliberate and lumbering. A single incorrect step can mean defeat, so concentration is paramount. There's a certain way you have to think about combat if you are a Souls player, like an almost new language in itself. It's not there to appease us, it's there to remind us that combat is not meant to be fun, but engaging. For all its complexity, the system is fairly simple. You can attack, defend, parry, dive, position, and mostly die. There are no complex combos, no quarter circle inputs to execute a move. It's just you, a simple skill set, and an array of human and demonic foes. There's no excuse for death apart from your own lack of knowledge, and it's not as if experts are somehow privy to things that you aren't. The PvP highlights how this system operates when put under pressure, and the Dark Souls competitive community is a thriving one. Dark Souls allows players to invade other people's worlds, to actually deliberately halt people's progress in an already hostile situation. For some reason, knowing how debilitating the game is, I just can't bring myself to do this. Maybe I'm just soft, but I don't doubt that many think like me as well. In any case, the combat in these games reinforce almost all the themes embedded in the story, doing away with that pesky dissonance that afflicts our medium. Ironic that it took a game about death and madness for that to coalesce, but then again, games are the art of failure. In the war of the ancients between dragons and gods, Seath the Scaleless betrayed his own kin and sided with the gods, turning the tide of the war. He was rewarded with dukedom and granted an archive to conduct his research into immortality. This obsession of our scaly friend is a rather human one, seen in the search for eternal life from the Epic of Gilgamesh to the alchemist looking for the Philosopher's Stone, extending to singularitarians like Ray Kurzweil who are questing for immortality. This idea of persisting paths to your death is also a guiding theme in the Metal Gear series, which confronts themes of breaking free of our genetics, asserting our independent will, and forging our own memes. The idea of a meme harkens to Richard Dawkins' idea of there existing a replicator for cultural information, analogous to DNA for genetic information. Thoughts, ideas, and practices that are successful or likely to be copied get passed down as people voraciously copy one another. He chose meme, as it comes from mimesis, an ancient Greek term for mimicry. Dark Souls is obsessed with cycles, which is just a pattern that copies itself repeatedly. Instead of copying the present, we copy the past. Our lives are filled with them as well. Days turn into weeks, which turn into months and then years. Most of your Sundays are like every other Sunday, which is much like the God of the Hebrew tradition in that it's a day of rest. We are constantly repeating the patterns of the past. This is ultimately where Dark Souls' story wants to take us. Cycles of fire are eternally dwindling, and us, a protagonist trapped in a cycle of death, has to rebirth that cycle by definitively ending ours. A poetic transferal, perhaps. This is where repeating cycles can be a transcendent experience. Mircea Eliade argues that our repetition of the past is a way for us to access the eternal. He says, in imitating the exemplary acts of a god or of a mythic hero, or simply by recounting their adventures, the man of an archaic society detaches himself from profane time and magically re-enters the great time, the sacred time. In other words, by copying cycles, we become as gods.
You shall become as gods. All of you shall become as gods. All of you.
This was his argument for why we have rituals. Why do we celebrate Christmas, New Year's, and Easter every year without fail? Ultimately, we escape the decay of a world like Dark Souls by acting out cycles. What is the cycle we are acting out, though? Why, it's the hero's journey, of course. Games are uniquely situated to have us act the archetypical hero's journey because it forces us to embody the role ourselves. But what is this great time that Eliade speaks of? Well, ever wonder why we get lost for hours in a game and not even realize that an entire day might have passed? In game psychology, this is called flow, where our skills are confronted by equivalent challenge that puts us in a state of pure engagement. If a game is too easy, it feels boring and flaccid, and if it's too difficult, it is anxiety-inducing. An optimized challenge is crucial for fun, which is why games have different difficulty settings. This seems to be an argument for an easy mode in Dark Souls, right? The thing is, Dark Souls already has an easy mode. It's just built into the game. Like I said, you can level up, choose an easier class, summon others to help in your game, run past all the minor enemies once you've memorized their positions, or go online and look up strategies. Some games make you feel like an incompetent idiot for reducing the difficulty by not making it explicit. Dark Souls makes you feel smart for finding ways to overcome its systems. By calibrating the challenge to accommodate folk who have played games our entire life, but by also not patronizing those who don't have the same abilities, Dark Souls can quite literally be a religious experience. This is why the mechanical conceit of difficulty perfectly ties into what the story's themes are about. The challenge of Dark Souls allows us to escape the present, just like acting out cycles allows us to escape the present. The fact that the challenge comes from repeated cycles of death is a nice poetic coincidence. It's ritualized death, which is ultimately what games are about. It's argued that much of our modern anxiety comes from doing away with rituals and traditions that allowed us to access the eternal, whatever it may be. This gives us a terror of history, the idea that things are bad and will continue to deteriorate. Dark Souls confronts this issue head-on, as everyone is ever consumed with delaying the inevitable decay of all they know. The gods are either dead, dying, deceptive, or being killed by you. For a chosen undead prophesies to prolong the age of the gods, you sure do a lot of killing. We reveal Guinevere to be an illusion cast by Gwendolyn to keep the facade of prosperity alive, but all this will be destroyed by us as well. We kill Seath, the four kings, the bed of chaos, and all the demons it spawns. We kill undead soldiers, Death himself, and the revered pantheon all the way up to the children of Gwyn, and then Gwyn himself. This is a far more literal interpretation of Nietzsche's claim that God is dead, and we killed him. The character Gwendolyn is interesting to think about. This child of Gwyn was born a male, but raised as a female because of her affinity for the moon. She was ostracized by her father, not being featured in any statue work or paintings. Yet for reasons unknown, she remained in Anor Londo even after everyone else either left or died to tend over her father's kingdom. She resides near the tomb of her father, and she's the one who casts the illusion of Guinevere to bequeath the player with the Lord Vessel once you have defeated Ornstein and Smough. Could it be that this most loyal of children was manipulating us from the start to carry out her father's will? Most players will not have uncovered this on their first playthrough, instead assuming the noble mantle of chosen undead is a deserving birthright. What game doesn't have us play a role where one is destined for greatness? We are being led to the slaughter by our own desire for being heroic, but this act of manipulation is being carried out by an ill-treated, fiercely loyal, and ultimately deeply misunderstood daughter who just wants the appreciation of her father. There have been a lot of games that have critiqued the nature of agency in games, Bioshock, Spec Ops, and Metal Gear Solid 2 chief among them, but none do it in such a subtle and poetically understated way. Nietzsche also talked about cycles, curiously enough, and his idea of the eternal recurrence. To simplify a complicated topic, time is infinite but objects are finite, hence they are bound to continuously reoccur. But then again, time is convoluted, but we'll put that aside for now. To push back against this horrifying aspect of reality, one must exercise amor fati, or the love of fate. The key to a life well lived is to be okay with having to live the same life repeatedly without anything being different, and to revel in the fatalistic. Is there purpose in futility then? To exhibit this sense is to appreciate life for what it is, suffering and all. This is the opposite of Eastern philosophical traditions like Hinduism and Buddhism that ask us to escape the present by transcending the self and eternal cycles, and different from the Western idea of transcending the self once we perish. The true golden mean, to use Aristotle's phrase, lies somewhere in the middle. Fortunately, Dark Souls occupies that space. Perhaps this expert can put it better. Walter Kaufmann wrote that Nietzsche celebrates the Greeks who, facing up to the terrors of nature and history, did not seek refuge in a Buddhistic negation of the will, as Schopenhauer did, but instead created tragedy in which life is affirmed as beautiful in spite of everything. We can only appreciate the good if we are mired in the bad, the holy if we escape the profane by acting out cycles, and the beautiful if we are confronted with constant challenge. It's a good thing then that Dark Souls is about acting out eternal cycles by confronting insurmountable challenges, and learning to love it for what it is because it clarifies, cleanses, and invigorates. Dark Souls systemizes through gameplay that which is beautiful, by throwing hardship at us and making us love it. Dark Souls is hard, but then again, so is life. But life sucks, and yet Dark Souls is our escape from it. The real world seems profane and misguided, yet Dark Souls is filled with intrigue, purpose, and romance. The old saying goes that the meek shall inherit the earth, but Dark Souls opposes this. It challenges us to sharpen our wits, our guile, and our resilience in a harsh but ultimately safe playground. Every time I play the game again, I can't help but feel that the themes of death, madness, decay, corruption, cycles, and futility are ultimately the greatest affirmation of life. I replay the game every year in this almost quasi-ritualistic fashion, in keeping with its cyclical conceit. It both thrusts us into the hero's journey, but simultaneously deconstructs it by suggesting our actions are futile and perhaps detrimental. It uses ambiguity to clearly assert the liabilities of absolute certainty. I can think of no other piece of media, regardless of the medium, that has this effect. This to me is what the essence of Dark Souls is, and why the liberal overuse of the meme "the Dark Souls off" is annoying. The surface level difficulty is just a vehicle. What Dark Souls is ultimately is an affirmation of life through repeated death. This, in essence, is what a game is too. Then again, no one really knows what Dark Souls is about.